Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I want to welcome you to the other side of history. Now, in this talk, we are going to talk on the Protestant reformer Jerome. Jerome was a citizen of Prague and became a very close friend to the reformer John Huss. While in England, Jerome accepted the teachings of John Wycliffe, and he joined the work of reform. Jerome had brilliancy, genius, eloquence, and learning, and these gifts won him popular favor. Jerome, however, did not have as many of the qualities which constitute that real strength of character that Huss had. In respects of that real depth of character, Huss was the greater of the two reformers. Jerome was more of an impulsive spirit than Huss. Huss had a calm judgment and helped to put a restraint upon Jerome, who respected him and yielded to his counsels. After the death of John Huss, there was a storm of indignation that arose from the violation of his safe conduct. Because of this, the council, who had burnt John Huss at the stake, determined that instead of burning Jerome, they would try to force him, if possible, to retract. In 1414, Jerome was summoned to appear before the Council of Constance. He was guaranteed a safe passage by that same emperor, Sigismund, but like John Huss, the safe passage, it lasted only until he reached Constance. He was then arrested and thrown into prison. What Jerome actually became known for was his recantation. Because he recanted, we may be tempted to place judgment on Jerome as being weak. But before we pass too much judgment upon him, we should question ourselves if we would have done any better under such a test. The book, Great Controversy by E.G. White, says that at the beginning of Jerome's imprisonment, his suffering was severe. Death would have been welcome instead of torture, the torture that he had to go through. He was weakened by illness and separated by friends. We are told that Jerome actually took the death of his friend, John Huss, very hard. The Inquisition was established in 1478. Now, I don't know how much actual torture Jerome had to go through, but in the year 1871, J.A. Wiley, he visited the Inquisition in Nuremberg, and he wrote a description of what he saw. There were instruments for compressing the fingers till the bones should be squeezed to splinters. There were instruments for probing below the fingernails till an exquisite pain, like a burning fire, would run along the nerves. There were instruments for tearing out the tongue, for scooping out the eyes, for grubbing up the ears. There were cradles set full of sharp spikes in which victims were laid and rolled from side to side, the wretched occupant being pierced at each movement of the machine with innumerable sharp points. There were chestfuls of small but most ingeniously constructed instruments for pinching, probing, or tearing the most sensitive parts of the body, and continuing the pain up to the very verge where reason or life gives way. With all of the pressure, Jerome, his fortitude finally did give way, and he consented to submit to the council. He pledged himself to adhere to the Catholic faith and accepted the action of the council there in condemning the doctrines of Wycliffe and even of his own very dear friend, John Huss. With the exception of the holy truths which they had taught, with this recantation, Jerome, he hoped to silence the voice of conscience and to escape his doom. However, when thrown back into the solitude of his dungeon, Jerome saw more clearly what he had actually done. He thought of the courage and the fidelity of John Huss. And in contrast, he pondered his own denial of the truth. He thought of the divine master, whom he had pledged himself to serve, and who for his sake had endured the death of the cross. Before his retraction, he had found comfort, amid all of his sufferings, in the assurance of God's favor. But now, remorse and doubts, they tortured his soul. He knew that still other retractions must be made before he could be at peace with Rome. The path upon which he was entering could end only in complete apostasy. His resolution was taken. To escape a brief period of suffering, he would not deny his Lord. It has been said that the rack was used in 1420, which was well before the Inquisition. Remember that the Inquisition was said to be instituted in 1478. The rack was the most common method of torture. So if the rack was used in Jerome's time, they said that the victim, stripped of his clothing, he was stretched by various methods, which were like pulleys, screws, and weights, until he either confessed that he was wrong or revealed the names of other heretics, or stoically remained silent. And all the while, the monk who inflicted the torture stood over the victim, robed in black from head to foot, his face concealed except for 2 openings through which his eyes peered out. After Jerome's initial recantation, he determined to not betray his Lord a second time. He was again brought before the council because his submission was not satisfactory to his judges. Their thirst for blood was whetted by the death of John Huss, and they clamored for fresh victims. Only by an unreserved surrender of the truth would Jerome be able to preserve his life. But now he had determined to avow his faith and to follow his brother martyr, Huss, to the flames. Jerome renounced his former recantation and solemnly required an opportunity to make his defense. The prelates feared the effect of his words and insisted that he should merely affirm or deny the truth of the charges brought against him. Jerome protested against such cruelty and injustice. He said, "You have held me shut up 340 days in a frightful prison in the midst of filth, noisomeness, stench, and the utmost want of everything. You then bring me out before you, and, lending an ear to my mortal enemies, you refuse to hear me. If you be really wise men, and the lights of the world, take care not to sin against justice. As to me, I am only a feeble mortal. My life is but of little importance. And when I exhort you not to deliver an unjust sentence, I speak less for myself than for you." Amazingly, Jerome's request was finally granted. In the presence of his judges, Jerome, he knelt down and he prayed that the divine spirit might control his thoughts and words, that he might speak nothing contrary to the truth, or anything unworthy to his master. To him that day was fulfilled, that promise that God gave to his first disciples there. "Ye shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, but when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what ye shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour when ye shall speak. For it is not ye that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you." And that's from the book of Matthew, chapter 10, and that's verses 18 through 20. The words that Jerome spoke, They excited astonishment and admiration, even in his enemies, we're told. For a whole year, he had been kept in a dungeon, unable to read and even to see because of the darkness. He was in great physical suffering and mental anxiety. Yet his arguments were presented with as much clearness and power as if he had had undisturbed opportunity for study. He pointed his hearers to the long line of holy men who had been condemned by unjust judges. Again, the book Great Controversy by E.G. White says, in almost every generation have been those who, while seeking to elevate the people of their time, have been reproached and cast out, but who, in later times, have been shown to be deserving of honor. Christ himself was condemned as a malefactor at an unrighteous tribunal. When he recanted, Jerome had said that the sentence was just in condemning John Huss. Now he declared his repentance of this and bore witness to the innocence and the holiness of the martyr John Huss. I knew him from his childhood, Jerome said. Huss was a most excellent man, just and holy. He was condemned notwithstanding his innocence. I also am ready to die. I will not recoil before the torments that are prepared for me by my enemies and false witnesses, who will one day have to render an account of their impostors before the great God, whom nothing can deceive. In self-reproach for his own denial of the truth, Jerome continued, of all the sins that I have committed since my youth, none weigh so heavy on my mind and cause me such poignant remorse as that which I committed in this fatal place, when I approved of the iniquitous sentence rendered against Wycliffe and against the holy martyr John Huss, my master and my friend. Yes, I confess it from my heart and declare with horror that I disgracefully quailed when, through a dread of death, I condemned their doctrines. I therefore supplicate Almighty God to deign to pardon me my sins, and this one in particular, the most heinous of them all. Pointing to his judges, he said firmly, you condemned Wycliffe and John Huss, not for having shaken the doctrine of the church, but simply because they branded with reprobation the scandals proceeding from the clergy. Their pomp, their pride, and all the vices of the prelates and the priests, the things which they have affirmed and which are irrefutable, I also think and declare like them. His words were interrupted. The prelates, trembling with rage, cried out, what need is there for further proof? We behold with our own eyes the most obstinate of heretics. The sentence of condemnation was passed upon him. He was led out to the same spot upon which Huss had yielded up his life. With the procession of the burning of heretics, the victim or the victims were marched to the scaffold, followed by the magistrates, the prelates of the church, who were brilliantly arrayed. After a sermon and the chanting of the 51st Psalm, the victims were handed over to the secular authorities by the inquisitors, with a request that they be tenderly dealt with. What hypocrisy! The ceremony attracted enormous crowds, and 40 days' indulgence was offered. All those who graced the scene with their presence. The degrading and demoralizing effect on the spectators can hardly be estimated. Jerome's last words, they were actually a prayer. As the flames rose about him, he said, Lord, Almighty Father, have pity on me and pardon me my sins. For thou knowest that I have always loved thy truth. His voice ceased, but his lips continued to move in prayer. When the fire had done its work, the ashes of the martyr, with the earth upon which they rested, they were gathered up, and like those of Huss, were thrown into the Rhine. So perished God's faithful light bearer. But the light of the truths which Jerome and other reformers proclaimed, the light of their heroic example, could not be extinguished. As well might men attempt to turn back the sun in its course as to prevent the dawning of that day which was even then breaking upon the world. Like the words of that beautiful hymn, Faith of Our Fathers. It says, faith of our fathers, living still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear that glorious word. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we would be true to thee till death. Our fathers chained in prisons dark were still in heart and conscience free. How sweet would be their children's fate if they, like them, could die for thee. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. We will love both friend and foe in all our strife, and preach thee too, as love knows how, by kindly words and virtuous life. Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. If you have enjoyed this little talk, I would just like to encourage you to push on that subscribe and that like button and leave your comments. And I just want to thank you for listening, and God bless.